let's talk about oogenesis, which is a fancy word that means making eggs. Obviously, this process is going to happen in the ovaries. The ovaries contain these multicellular structures called follicles. And the follicle contains a cell called an oocyte, and that oocyte is what's going to grow up, develop, and get larger and become an egg. So this is the process we're going to learn about right now. Before birth, a human female is going to make all of the oocytes she will ever have in her whole life. So she will be born with about 1.5 million primordial follicles, and each of those primordial follicles is going to have a primordial oocyte in it. These cells are going to go through the first part of meiosis and then pause. And then they're going to stay paused until some point in the future after puberty, when they will be called upon to continue their development. Beginning at puberty and every month thereafter, about 20 primordial follicles mature into primary follicles. And when we look at an ovary on a microscope slide, we can actually see this happening. So the primordial follicles are these little tiny structures, just a few follicle cells around an oocyte that's much bigger than the follicle cells. And then as it develops into a primary oocyte, the follicle itself takes on a more distinct shape. The oocyte gets bigger. The oocyte is surrounded by a layer, one of these layers is called granulosa cells. If that reminds you of the skin, the stratum granulosum, that's because these are also full of little granules. And those granules contain, well, a bunch of secretions. Part of those are estrogen. So as this follicle matures, these granulosa cells are going to build up and secrete estrogen. And so estrogen levels are going to increase as the follicle increases. That estrogen then is going to make the uterine lining, that endometrial layer, thicken. So the endometrial layer is thickening as this follicle is maturing. Each primary follicle then develops into a secondary follicle. And when it develops into a secondary follicle, we still have a primary oocyte, and that has to do with how far in meiosis it's gotten, and we'll come back to that. But you can see on a microscope slide this really distinct change where the secondary follicle now has what we call an antrum, which is this space between the two layers of the follicle. So we've got the oocyte surrounded by a layer of cells. Then the antrum is this fluid-filled space, and then around that is the layer of granulosa cells. And that whole thing is the follicle. When this finally matures, some of these cells, these corona radiata cells, are going to be ovulated along with the oocyte. The rest of these cells are going to stay in the ovary and stay as a follicle. Now, some of the primary oocytes that started this development, they're not going to finish. Most of them won't finish. Only one or two is going to make it to the secondary oocyte or secondary follicle stage, and only one is going to be ovulated under normal circumstances. Of course, sometimes two get ovulated. If they both get fertilized, you end up with fraternal twins. So those are twins that are the result of two separate eggs being fertilized. So once we see the mature follicle, we see a big change. The antrum now is much larger, much more space between the oocyte and the far side of the follicle. And then this is now prepared for ovulation, which of course is the release of the oocyte from the ovary. The oocyte is now a secondary oocyte. It has stopped in meiosis 2, and the original cell has now divided into two cells. The original cell had 46 chromosomes like every other somatic cell in the human body. That means every cell, somatic means of the body. Okay, the only cells in humans that don't have 46 chromosomes are the gametes, which have 23 chromosomes. Cells with 46 or 2 of each chromosome are called diploid. Cells with half the number of chromosomes or 1 of each chromosome are called haploid. In the ovary, the cytoplasm doesn't separate evenly in creating this oocyte. One of the cells gets all of the cytoplasm, and the other one is essentially a plasma membrane and a nucleus, and that's all. It doesn't have enough cytoplasm to keep growing and to further divide, so it's just going to be reabsorbed by the ovary. That's called a polar body. So at this point that we have the mature follicle, we have created a secondary oocyte and a polar body. The polar body we can't see on here. It's just going to be reabsorbed by the ovary and its material recycled into other cells. At ovulation, the oocyte and the cells surrounding it are released from the ovary, and most of the granulosome cells and the outer cells of the follicle stay in the ovary. Okay, and that's important because remember, those granulosa cells secrete hormones. They're going to stick around and secrete hormones to support the pregnancy if fertilization happens. Sorry, I feel like I went across two there. Okay. So the follicle stays. If it becomes this structure called the corpus luteum, and it starts decreasing the amount of estrogen it produces, but it produces more of this second hormone called progesterone. Progesterone signals to the uterus that ovulation has happened. It also signals to the brain. There's a lot of communication back and forth. We'll come back to that. The hormones stimulate the continued building up of the uterine lining to prepare the uterus for implantation of the blastocyst. And we can actually see these. Here's the mature follicle in the ovary, and here's the corpus luteum. You can see it's a much different looking thing, mostly made up of those sort of granulosome cells. Now, if fertilization occurs, then meiosis is completed, and the oocyte becomes an actual egg. And it's kind of weird. It's only an egg for a moment before it fuses fully with the sperm and becomes a zygote. At this point, the second polar body is also formed. And just like the first one, it's a nucleus with a plasma membrane around it and not much else. All of the cytoplasm is now in the egg. So that egg is a huge, huge cell. And it needs to be because that whole blastocyst is going to come just from that egg. It doesn't get any added molecules to it until after implantation. If fertilization does occur, the corpus luteum continues producing hormones for about the first 3 months of gestation until the amniotic sac and the placenta have developed enough to produce the hormones on their own. At that point, the corpus luteum, that's supposed to be corpus, not corpus. So it's going to continue to develop for about 3 months. Then it's going to start to degenerate. If fertilization does not degenerate, then it never fully develops into a corpus luteum. It starts to develop into a corpus luteum and then goes straight into becoming a corpus albicans. Albicans means white. So it's this white body, and that's just the corpus luteum, this leftover follicle, breaking down and being reabsorbed by the ovary. If fertilization does not occur and the corpus luteum degenerates, then it stops making progesterone, it stops making estrogen, and that signals for the endometrial layer that has built up that to be shed so that the menstrual cycle can start over again. So that's when menstruation occurs. So this is that whole thing together. And I know you can't read this from here, but do look at this in the textbook. So we have the first diploid cell, an oogonium, going through mitosis to create this oocyte. This happens before birth. This is the primordial oocyte. It just waits through childhood until puberty. And then at puberty, it starts to do the first of two divisions during meiosis. This happens as the follicle is going from primary follicle to secondary follicle. The secondary oocyte has split. It is now haploid, meaning it has one of each chromosome. So we've gone from 46 chromosomes to 23. And you see that one of these is huge, the other is tiny, and that's the polar body. If it gets fertilized, it becomes an egg, finishes this split, the nucleus splits into 2 cells, each with 23 chromosomes. This is the same kind of split we saw in mitosis, where the duplicated DNA strands are splitting. So each cell ends up with the right amount of DNA, and again we have an ovum and a polar body. So in the human female, you start meiosis with 1 cell and you end up with 1 egg. Okay? Now this is going to be different than in the human male, and in most organisms where meiosis starts with 1 cell and ends with 4 cells. In the human female, you end with 1 cell and 2 polar bodies. That's the end of oogenesis, and stay tuned for the next one.